very much indeed, and thank you all, because this is a very special day. Partly because it was 10 years ago that I first stood here representing Cambridge, and partly because today I have the exciting experience of representing an institution that doesn't feel squeamish about chanting its own name. Apologies if this is quick. This is literally all the debates. I'm going to make up to 17 arguments in up to 4 clusters. Cluster 1, justice. Recognise that any government, no matter where you live, ultimately appeals to some sort of recourse to violence, whether instantiated or merely possible. Whether you have direct experience of living in a cruel dictatorship where your loved ones have been killed for their views, or whether you simply live in a state where your freedom is constantly conditional on what the policeman around the corner decides to do. Any state necessitates the threat of violence. That is the tragedy of collective action, and it won't go away under either side. However, that tragedy creates a responsibility on behalf of the powerful to be at very least accountable to those to whom they bear power. For you to have at least some ability to control your own life. This is a policy that, at a stroke, gets rid of dictatorship. We think that that is a large impact on our side. I'm surprised they said this, right? But that's a very big impact. We think it's quite good. But equally, let's consider in more detail, because recognise that people will be able to exercise power in a lot of new and useful ways. Certainly there will be asymmetries and imperfections in that power, but compared to dictatorship, at least it will be a win. We recognise that there will be a certain delocalisation of that power. That's to say that the votes that you get will influence states elsewhere, like current states elsewhere, as well as your own. We think that's probably why the model asks for, and why we would support, a kind of loosely federated collection of states, right? Like the republic that's in the motion. But recognise that under this system, where you do not anymore have national boundaries, at very least you get a greater ability, at least among people who are fortunate to have wealth, to be able to relocalise themselves into a local polity that makes more sense to them. So that again enables them to be more in environments which they feel are conducive to them. Equally, you get a greater ability to form coalitions and militate for your own interests, even where that might be impossible at the moment because particular interest groups are scattered. So, for instance, we're talking about the fact that in comparatively illiberal countries at the moment, you are more able to start to form coalitions with, for instance, other people advocating for rights for your minority group or for people with your sexuality in other states as well. So all of that means that individuals have got more ability to advocate. But the main theft that is perpetrated as part of the existing system also dissipates under this model, right? Because at the point at which countries are no longer allowed to enforce boundaries, enforce borders about who can go where, you are no longer literally stealing the ground underneath people's feet from them and saying that you exercise some sort of property and control over that state. There was a clarification.
Yeah, could you maybe tell us, for example, I don't know, what the currency is going to be, what the language is going to be, if you have any how is this a luxury, Sam?
I mean, I could. I just wait for them to make boring arguments about the fact that not everyone will speak the same language, right? That'll be fine. I really don't. Bitcoin. I want to now talk about something different. I want to talk about systemic disadvantage. Because the problem with the world isn't that we don't have enough resources for all of the people who have needs, but rather that those resources are systematically sequestered and obtained by the wealthy few in order to oppress the many. The system of states is nothing more than an excuse to maintain disadvantage across boundaries, right? To say that we don't feel we should be giving as much foreign aid in the way that we do take care of people in our own state. Recognise that under this system, the global poor massively outnumber the global rich, right? The sorts of legislatures that you're going to get voted in are going to be those that exercise redistribution on a grand scale. That means that suddenly you no longer have the enormous injustice that we see in the world today, where some starve while others prosper. But recognise that at the moment, even if you, for some selfish reason, care only about people in the country you currently reside, recognise that the excuses that the right repeatedly uses in order to prevent redistribution within countries, arguments that capital will fly overseas, that people will move their wealth offshore, none of those arguments work anymore, because there isn't any bloody overseas anymore. So you're able to enforce, to actually have a discussion about justice for the first time, rather than the brutal pragmatism of a Lahav. That is a better world to be in, both within states and across them. Equally, rather than the servile system of foreign aid in which the rich make decisions about how to allocate resources to the poor, instead you get a better world in which people are able to advocate for their own rights. If they want to contest whether this is truly a more just world, recognise that you need to be aperspectival about ethics, right? There is no good reason to say any individual ought to have more than somebody else ought to have a priori because of the lottery of birth. And even if you want to recourse to the kind of sort of shallow utilitarianism reflective of the moral decay of modern debating, you end up with a system in which you simply allocate utility more efficiently, right? Because it's worth an awful lot more to them than it is to you. But as part of this system, what you start to see is a gradual cultural change. You acquire the routines of a polity. You start to have discussions around elections about what is in the common interest. Perhaps those discussions have to have simultaneous translation. We'll swallow that. But ultimately, you start to talk and think and act more like a polity. You feel more commonality with your fellow person in a way that you do not at the moment, because the system of states maintains the myth that you are different in order to enable you to subjugate them. Propose.
So as was mentioned here, Ireland and Israel are very close alphabetically. One of the best benefits of that is the fact that in international conferences, Ireland separates Israel from Iran. On the other side, they will shove them together in one state and things will be wonderful. If they think we're going to run world utility, they do not know Tel Aviv. Two main things I'm going to talk about. First, why there cannot be a democracy without a shared identity, and why a shared identity is not possible within that super state. Secondly, on why we get more oppression, worse policies for everyone involved. Rebuttal is going to be quite simple. So, first, note that their first point is people are trapped within the state has so much power over them. We would say, by that logic, it is much preferable, it is far preferable that people are able to choose which state they are in. That mechanism of competition is something that happens on our side that does not happen on theirs. And if the state oppresses me, we currently have ways of opting out of states which they do not allow on their side. Secondly, they say, oh, we'll have a federal government which leaves a lot of level of control to individuals, but still allows things like free movement. No, a federal level can limit the amount of trade you have, it can limit even movement between those states, and we think that is a likely scenario, but it definitely does not mean that you now spread resources in an equitable and beneficial manner. Note that everything they talk about in redistribution does not happen within the United States today, does not happen within the UK today. happen within any democracy today. We just don't know why the 99% on their side are more empowered than they are on status quo in each and every individual country. We say that if the United States is not able to do this for African Americans and white people, it is definitely not likely that we will be able to do this for Iraqi Sunnis and Shiites with German and every other nationality that doesn't share the same conceptions. So let's go into that right now. Because we say that democracy has to presuppose two basic assumptions in order to function, in order to exist. First, I accept the legitimacy of other people and their rights. I take their rights seriously because we are part of a collective with certain goals. I acknowledge them as equal individuals to myself. Secondly, and even more importantly, I accept that group's right to make decisions for myself. We say that for these two conditions to exist, we need people to have a shared identity and a notion that they are part of the same group. We say that in the sense of how people identify themselves, every group is every in-group is defined in relation to another. In the sense that I cannot feel a shared identity with everyone in the world. That just in the sense of how I get prioritized to join a certain group and to abide by that logic of that group, that does not happen. But moreover, this is just on the principle level, but more practically, note that people remember they have been in different states. We have thousands of years of history where different states, different religions, different identities all exist. What does that tell us? That tells us the likely scenario is people do prioritize their in-group in this new group as well. They recognize their legitimacy significantly more. Why is this important? Because we say that this is exactly the reason that lack shared identity is exactly the reason multi-ethnic democracies tend not to work. This is the reason the Iraqi army was simply not willing to defend Sunnis against ISIS. This is exactly the reason you don't get that redistribution, you don't get people actually accepting the decisions of that state. That means at that point the state has to employ large-scale coercion in order to even make people accept its basic decisions. At that point, it is no longer in factuality a democracy. We don't think that's a system that gives more rights to people. We don't think that a system that gives more identity and self-determination to people, which is the essential function of states. But let's talk more practically about the sort of policies we are likely to see. Because we say that lacking shared identity, lacking shared consent, and given very varied interests that people have, there is no reason for a policy that will be equally beneficial, mutually beneficial to all. You can definitely do things like block people within the state, things like depriving people economically, things like gerrymandering and making sure that certain people's votes can carry significantly less weight. We don't need the vote of most people within that parliament. Note that under current status quo, if you turn everyone into one nation, China and India basically have an automatic majority within that parliament. About the need to get the support of other people, it's much easier to rely on the nationalistic rhetoric of just saying we're prioritizing our own group and that is why you should choose. Moreover, people who have such an economic disparity, like countries in Africa, like the dictatorial countries that we want to talk about, have no way of influencing those bodies. They are so far away. They are so weakened economically. They are so weak. Their ability to inform themselves about these issues is so reduced. Moreover, we're likely to see the stronger populations within those countries actually immigrating to new centers when those borders are open, leaving those countries places even more marginalized. We just don't see any reason for that country and that parliament to actually cater for any of the needs, and even in terms of things like stopping civil wars that are still a thing that can happen there, because we just don't know why a German person or an American person would be willing to risk their soldiers in order to do this. I will take closely to the evidence.
Can you explain? Do you think it is true that the people of Cork and Dublin are culturally identical?
I think that they are. They will tell you that they feel significantly more like that than they do towards the British. And we say that they in contrast to. Now, but simply also on the level of their interest, we just don't see when you get any of your sovereignty. We don't think you get you solve discrimination. We don't think, and we think there are many people who are currently not oppressed that have their own states that do cater for them, and you put them under those systems of oppression as well. We think you just create more oppression and less rights to less people. But moreover, let's assume for a second that they're able to do away with national identities and make people buy into that, express those identities which we think is necessary in order for them to get the sort of shared identities that they want. We say, in likely scenarios, for people to coalesce around other sorts of identities, like religious identity, ethnic identity, which we say are significantly worse, since they are more binary. If I practice a certain religion, you're a heretic to me. That is not true for nationalism. But it is true for ethnicity, it is true for religion. And we say that those other identities are significantly worse as a basis for people's identity. We say that in the end of the day, we say that these countries are not likely to solve the sort of oppression that they want. They're unlikely to actually be democratic in the essential sense of the word. And we just say more oppression, less rights, less
And I now look to Darion Hotan to continue the case with the government.
We could have an extraordinarily tedious debate about the way this state will be internally organized and the way in which it adheres together to a common identity. Instead, I'm going to give you two arguments in this speech. Firstly, why democracy, and uniquely a common global democracy, is the only just arrangement of the state, and all other arrangements are morally problematic. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the perpetual peace, and why this is a world with less war. Firstly, justice. Sam gives you, and I'm going to extend on these, three core reasons why both democracy and a common global democracy are the only just arrangements for a state. The first reason is self-determination. I'm going to make a claim here, and I want to be very clear. If we hear any arguments from their side about competing values in this debate, like utilitarianism, the only reason anything in this world is valuable, including utility, is because a human wills it. Right? Value is not something that adheres outside of us in the world somehow. They will both be metaphysically strange, those properties will be quite unlike anything else in the world, and it will require us to believe we have some mysterious epistemic faculty to access these facts. That's false. Value comes from us. We will things as valuable, we assign them value. It follows from this that the thing of ultimate value is the value of a free human will, because that is the condition on which everything else is valuable. What follows from that is we think the only just arrangement is one that allows individuals the right to self-determine, to allow their wills to express themselves freely. I can see democracy doesn't allow this perfectly, right? Because obviously compromises are made to some degree. Obviously not everyone gets the party they want. But it is the only system that ensures at every level of representation that individuals are allowed to express their opinions, and those opinions directly translate into policy action, into the people who represent you and defend your interests. So in terms of self-determination, this is just a better system. Secondly, Sam tells you about violence, and we hear no response to this. We think the kind of violence that all states are inherently organized around is only legitimate if you consent to and have some control over the way it is exercised. Otherwise, it is nothing more than a raw exercise of power. No response from their side. But thirdly, and this is interesting, right? So why a common democracy? The reason for this is because of theft. Now, I know in debates we often say things are arbitrary, and that's taken to be equivalent to it being a bad thing. But here's the reason why arbitrariness is bad, right? The reason for that is people should not suffer as a consequences of occurrences beyond their control, right? We have an agentic view of what just desert is, and it is related to how much choice you have in the matter. If you are born to a country with a vast resource hinterland that happens to have exclusive control because of the arbitrary borders that were constructed 500 years ago, that is unfair. If you are born into a country with a great deal more poverty, for that same reason, that is unfair. And allowing nations to erect permanent borders around themselves is effectively a theft of a nation. Furthermore, we think it deprives people of the right to free movement, because insofar as you're born arbitrarily, and again, like we've given you the reason why arbitrary is bad, into a particular geographical location, we think it's a good thing to allow people to move around freely. But okay, what do we hear from the opposition on this point, right? First, they say people should be allowed to choose their own state. It's better if there are many, many of them. Okay, I want to be very clear, like, the state on our side is very, very unlikely to be completely homogeneous culturally, right? Like, as all states do, over time, communities develop in ways that express certain kinds of ideologies and certain norms. The difference is you're free to move between those communities on our side of the house to a much higher degree than we get on their side. Secondly, and I think this is the more interesting stuff, they say democracy requires a shared identity. I do not think this is true. I think democracy requires that we imagine sometimes we have a shared identity. I live in a country which is the definition of a cultural melting pot, right? 4 large, distinct ethnic groups, completely different religious backgrounds, completely different language, completely different geography. What keeps us together is that we tell ourselves a story of why we exist together. The difference is on this side, that story appeals to the entirety of humanity rather than to an individual tribe. Now, they say, what about people who hate each other, right, and refuse to live alongside each other? I mean, look, I'd like to point out, given the motion allows us to figure out this will happen without violence, presumably there is some willingness in this world for people to coexist. And I think that willingness comes most likely from a shared common view that we are all human and that living together is something that's possible. So, I mean, if this policy is possible at all, given the motion says, like, this can be done without violence, it presumes a willingness to live together, otherwise the policy just wouldn't work. So, on all these counts, the only just arrangement of the state is democracy. We get that on our side, their side remains the way it is now, and we think that it's morally effective. Let's talk about the perpetual peace. The first thing I want to note here is that war is much less likely to happen on our side. Even if conflict arises, democracies provide unique mechanisms to resolve conflict peacefully rather than appealing to violence itself. The reason for this is, firstly, if you have representatives you can appeal to, and if you have politicians you can lobby to express your interests, there is no need to recourse to violence that imposes greater costs on you as an individual or on you as a community. So, in the first place, I think communities which have disagreements in our side of the house are more likely to negotiate this through the mechanism of democracy that we offer them. The second thing to say here is Sam points out this is a much better world for the global poor. I mean, I think they're right when they say that, like to some degree, some nations which have a greater population will have a greater vote. But I mean, the one group in the world that has that cuts across all countries, that numbers in the billions, is the global poor. We think giving them uniquely a vote allows them to redistribute resources towards themselves in ways that they otherwise would not have. Any final closing? Hello.
So, by your analysis on democracy, who would you say best captures the human will by your standards? Singapore or the Republic of Weimar?
I mean, I don't know why that feels. I mean, look, I think that people can live together even though they look different and speak different languages. I think that what makes them able to live together is a story they tell of why they coexist together, and that story is what mobilizes people in ways that make them more willing to help each other out when their help is needed. But okay, so I think democracy has an inherent longevity about it, right? Because if the op here is that this democratic system will descend into civil war and collapse, no, firstly, I mean, we could do this policy again. Like, I don't see why there's a limit on the number of times we could create a global democracy without, conflict. But secondly, there's an inherent rational self-interest for you to preserve that democratic system, right? The reason for that is because the alternative systems of dictatorship, or a system of civil war, is one which is maximally disadvantageous to everyone, because you are always playing a game against each other for resources, you're playing a game against each other for self-interest. So, for this reason, there's an inherent rational pressure for this democracy to stay alive. Look, I mean, they might complicate this debate with questions about what this world will look like exactly. What I can tell you is that this world will be more just. Happy to propose.
Next level unconverted, huh?
Sam says that this is the only opportunity to, at 1 second, remove all the dictatorships around the world. We say that immediately we're going to create the greatest, most coercive one in the history of humanity. There is an asymmetry that we need to point out from the beginning of this debate. Note, building a state might be fine. A state falling apart does a lot of damage. The friends here from Yugoslavia, from former Yugoslavia, should notice that by heart. Note something which is meaningful here. Democracy in theory might be something which is meaningful. However, many implementations of them are awful. The worst conductor of human rights violation and genocide in the 20th century was elected democratically in Germany. The worst uses of institutionalized torture are happening right now in the quote-unquote greatest democracy in the history of the world. The greatest claim in slaves was done and normalized under the framework of a democracy. We dispute the premise that by definition of democracy, it's a Western, liberal, functional one. Guys, these days, we still read the notions of the letter. It doesn't give you that, and it matters a lot, because no, it doesn't matter. Theoretically, Sam is correct, but it might be more just. The burden on government scientists order show you why is it likely that the democracies that we're going to get is going to be a more just one. They say, look, we're going to get more freedom of movement. Zoning is something that actually happens with democracies right now. They say, look, we're going to get a better allocation and better catering for the poor. Not allocating money and creating huge gaps of inequality are happening in democracies right now. They say that voting is going to be much more meaningful for definition. Gerrymandering is happening in democracies right now, making the vote completely meaningless. Note something which is detrimental to the understanding of this debate here. They get appropriate to say that the transition to the democracy is going to be a peaceful one. The motion never states that democracy is going to be completely without violence. This is insane to say that it's never going to happen, nor does it state that this democracy is going to be completely stable and a perfect one. Essentially, the continuation of the case is going to be actually systematic, line by line, saying why essentially this is going to be a dysfunctional state that is going to deteriorate to a concentration of power and to actually be the worst dictatorship in the history of humanity. Note, moreover, one thing before entering that, they cannot say that we disallow violence and we're going to be in concept peace, because no, things as gangs exist within democracies now. Democracies do not cannot ban things as gun violence. We're just going to claim that these are going to be more manifestation of things which are going to be way worse off. Essentially, the Second Amendment on steroids and a global capacity. Functionality. A couple of points here on how this democracy is likely to be conducted. Firstly, note about the basic inherent characteristics of this democracy. It is geographically spread. You're unlikely to see the political might held on a day-to-day basis on a much greater scale that are happening within modern states right now. It is religiously and ethnically different. We are not removing these kinds of identities. This is a completely different notion and not to be part of it. The tactic of being able to throw a minority against a minority, creating divisions in order to get more political gains in power may still exist. Why does that matter? Less buying to it means less of an ability to collect taxes, less people who are willing to opt into the mechanism of the state, a crackdown on the rights of minorities and dissent, a prioritization of my own key group. Continuing another point here. No, because all of them existed before, they're just likely to continue to manifest their power and old ideologies. As we say in the first picture, goes unreplied, India and China have an almost automatic majority, which is happening right now, so there are no strong traditions of Western liberal democracy. Thirdly, governments have a tendency to just be bad at conducting many things right now, right? They don't guarantee things as securing tenureship to people who work in them. They have huge bureaucracies under this case. They don't promote proper incentives, and they come from huge moral hazard. Why does that matter? Because all of these problems are likely to be megally exacerbated and are recursive. Because every time an opposition group, which is likely to say that another group is worse, is likely to take a toll on the government and make it less excessive into pushing its policies, means that it's going to gain more strength, and therefore the government is going to get less of it. Being less functional means less of a bite. This is a fool's errand of going a cycle which is going to continue over and over and over again. This is a time to tell you what it does in the debate. Firstly, for the 5 billion people who already live in a democracy right now, we're creating something which is significantly dysfunctional to the comparative. Meaning they have less of an ability to principally manifest their power. They have less of an ability to get a functional state that caters for their needs. They get less of an ability to cater for minorities and have a buy and collect more taxes, and these are huge harms. Moreover, note that the that are joining in are actually for states that are currently, even in the dictatorship, might be somehow okay for them. Like China is not automatically bad for the Chinese people. It might be for the entirety of the world, but you don't agree that the fact that you live under a dictatorship is automatically something which is awful and worse. However, a functional democracy is. And now, in the idea of why it's likely to fall apart, before that, yes.
We don't have to think that democracies are perfect at equalising themselves, to think that it's a damn sight better than the world at the moment.
No, but this is the comparative electronics. This is exactly what we're doing. So in terms of policies and how they happen, the combination of resentment, which is likely to account in the first point, is combined with a couple of other things. A collective, inherent idea of concentration of power. The fact that there is a huge spread, which creates a necessity to do things, is creating a huge bureaucracy in one place and able to manage it, however, also creates an ability to control everything in one place and not seeing people who might get hurt. The simple greed of people and the idea that they just want more power. The fact that you have a fear of losing that kind of power, that you actually have an incentive to zone out complete areas to make sure that they cannot take governments into the future. Combined with the idea that more despair over the system and less buying leads more despair over the system creates an incentive to not be as knowledgeable, to continue to update on the current affairs, to be able to criticize your government properly and therefore being able to have it and actually make sure that it's going to be accountable. A couple of effects that are going to accrue as a damage here. Firstly, note, this is something which has a natural tendency to over time erode the democratic mechanisms that exist today. To actually make sure that things as gerrymandering are going to be significantly worse. To make sure that bureaucracy is going to have much more power. To make sure that people that voted you in are not going to vote you out, which is worse. Moreover, there is no fiat on their side of the house saying people cannot die and drop out, which is the likely outcome here. However, this does accrue in many cases of using force against them, of making sure that oppression exists on a violent scale, of using your army in order to stop them. This is exactly where the idea of Yugoslavia comes forward. The idea that you have a huge fear that you are going to take a huge toll on countries that are trying to separate from you. There are two impacts here. The first is you're likely to over time erode every democratic mechanism we have today. The second is the fact that many people are likely to just live in countries which are in a state of war at the end, just in a long-term one. Oppose.
Thank you, honourable guests, for their speech. And now there's Alasdair Donovan, where is the case for the government.
What if people does not implement they just excommunicate the picture? This guy, why did they say that? Am I in you could have asked them after this, you know?
Opening government, we're probably allowed to be unspecific about the specifics of this government, because it would have been unfair for them to have met in a perfect democracy. I think reciprocally, it's unfair of Tel Aviv to say it's going to be the worst possible democracy and the worst iteration of a democratic structure. Presumably there will be some forms of checks and balances. Presumably there'll be some additional degree of accountability that means you're not allowed to completely erode the rights of certain groups. But even on that point, it seems somewhat unlikely that you're going to have one individual geographic interest being able to dominate everyone else. Because the number of other people against you and the number of different interests is so large, literally the entire world, that there's no way for you to get a plurality in that instance. They say India and China. We think given the massive internal disagreements within those countries and given the fact they kind of hate each other, means they're unlikely to form this bloc. Three things in this speech. Firstly, voting and identity, addressing most of the stuff from here out of opening up. Secondly, what kind of policies a global government can do, trivially why those are massively beneficial and we probably like them. Thirdly, some notion about in-groups and the sort of theory behind that and why it might be valuable or not. Firstly, voting and identity. Ayal claims votes are based upon pre-existing geography and we're going to tie people to these old borders, and for some reason all votes are going to be based on that. We think that's probably unlikely. We think it's likely people will vote on their lives and the issues that matter to them.
And we think even if India and China are large, we think if the majority of the world are starving and they're able to vote to get food and to have that redistributed to them, they're probably going to vote to do that. We think even though there are times when welfare isn't perfect in the status quo, in most democracies it kind of is. Even the US allows food stamps for most people, and we think that's probably a good thing. They say gerrymandering. We have two responses. Firstly, it's probably kind of hard when it's billions of people. The scale you need to do it on requires such a degree of control that no one would initially be able to get. It's somewhat unlikely. But secondly, I still think there's a situation where group interests are going to apply. Because if a small group is trying to dominate everyone else, they are themselves against the entirety of the world. It seems unlikely that's a position they're going to be able to sustain for a very long period of time. We think the majority of the world probably likes things like basic welfare, probably likes the ability to live, and we think they're probably going to vote to redistribute it to them. We think that means people don't die, and that's a good thing. We're going to give an additional note here. The current system of borders allows for a system of slavery. We look at things like immigration, illegal immigration, which is pretty much determinative of the economies of many major countries. You have a situation where you take quasi-slave labour and refuse to enfranchise them. Agrarian quasi-slave labour in the United States, literal slave labour in Qatar. We think that we get to end all of this and enfranchise all these people, because no matter where you are still a global citizen and you are still entitled to a set of basic rights that you no longer are able to be kept from. We think this is kind of important, because given slavery is a denial of all basic freedoms and we get to end that, we take a stab against the worst possible harm you can commit on other people. Second argument, global government. We imagine that a global government will probably do things quite well, even if it's reasonably federated, on a global set of policies. We think things like a global carbon tax would be a good example. But we think the main thing you're likely to get out of a global government is the types of policies that affect the entire world but don't properly affect individual countries. Those issues that are diffuse but ultimately require action from all of us. And we think environmental policy is the most important of these. It is impossible to achieve under the status quo. And the reason for this is that it is the interest of individual governments it's the interest of a global government to keep the planet functioning, but it's in the interest of individual governments not to. Because when you have multiple different governments, their interests are to play themselves against each other. They want everyone else to act and not themselves. And the only way to get most governments to agree, those governments that are polluting a lot at the moment, and ultimately are doing so because they are massively economically deprived relative to everyone else, would be massive wealth transfers in their favour to offset historic development of powers which have traditionally oppressed them. Issue with this is that at the moment there's no way we can achieve that. There is no coercive mechanism that will make the United States give money to these countries in anywhere near a sufficient amount to get them to change their policies. What do? We give a coercive mechanism. We give a state where we're able to explicitly say the laws are we are going to change, and we're going to enact policy that means we can save the planet. The majority of the world, numerically, lives in areas that are going to be affected by natural disasters. We think they're probably going to want those to stop. Nothing is possible without a planet to live on. No set of rights are available, no conflicts or lives can happen unless we have a planet first to be able to enjoy those rights and to enjoy those things on. Without air to breathe, without clean water to drink, we all die, and everything else dies with us. We think as a consequence, if we can change global climate policy, if we can result in having a planet, that is the single greatest impact we can have, because it ensures that most people are allowed to live. And it has more impacts than anything else for two reasons. Firstly, at the moment, millions of people are dying. We think it probably is killing more people than anything else. We think getting to change that is a good thing. But secondly, over the long term, billions will die, probably all humans, like definitionally all humans, if we lose the planet. All other stuff you can have is contingent upon being alive. Future people are as valuable as current people, because when we know they are going to live, when we know they are going to suffer and experience things in the same way that we do, then we say they have equivalent rights to us. The fact they will exist and the fact that we are not doing things to help them mean that we are actively harming them by omission. We think as a consequence of that there's an absolute duty to change things to ensure that they are able to live, and it is immoral to make them suffer. A global government is the only way we're able to change that. Does anyone have a point of information?
We want to give you
Fair. Do you want to engage with me?
Yeah, of course.
Go.
We've seen in the EU how it's been a massive struggle to combine various different economies and at numerous points, numerous countries.
Yeah, the problem with having economic union, without political union, is it tends not to work without governmental structures. And we get to fix that by a global government, kind of dull. Okay, in-groups, cannibalistic competition. People form in-groups. This is insightfully noted by opening opposition. There are thousands of them in your life based on every person you meet. You prioritise the members of these groups. What we get to do uniquely by having a global government is destroy these artificial enfranchisements found of one of these groups that you therefore prioritise above everything else. Because we destroy the cultural difference in a meaningful way, as there is no border, there is no official line separating you from any other human being. We think over time this means most people are unlikely to care about where those existing borders were, but to see other people as humans. More importantly, in the short term, it means that this set of policies becomes structurally impossible. Because at the moment we have things like mutual competition, preventing very basic things being implemented and ensuring a set of cannibalistic policies that harm everyone in the world. The reason we can't tax corporations is because under the status quo, Ireland won't make them pay any tax if they headquarter themselves there. We think that is something that should change. Similarly, it is now going to be the case that nuclear weapons are irrelevant because the mad doctrine no longer applies when we're all one country. We think removing the means to blow up the planet and kill literally everyone is probably a net benefit. We get to avoid every single doomsday scenario that results in the planet ending, and we're the only way we can avoid a set of them like climate change. This means literally everyone's life is saved. In terms of utilitarianism, that's probably the most impactful thing. In terms of any other rights, they're contingent upon life, so we probably win the debate for that reason.
The best way to do the Ireland reflection in the speech.
You only made yourself drowned out. It's because
Yeah. Huh? From this game, just get up there. You need to take photos of the systems. I don't know how you're gonna do it.
You do?
Go ahead. Try. Sneak photo.
The only reason why solving the collective action problem of government can be a good thing is if your economic pot not only increases or stays the same, but also you're able to effectively distribute it across the world like government wants to. I want to prove to you two simple things. One, the economic pot that you have will decrease substantially, so not only do you have less money to distribute, but secondly, why it's not going to be distributed in the way you want it to. Second, if the economy tanks, I'm going to explain to you why you get a lot more conflict on our side of the house. So first, jumping right into it. One, why do you have less money made in the economy? I'm not quite sure it was the best strategic decision for opening government to say open borders in the world. But hey ho, they did it. What is the problem with that? People from the worst off parts of the world are going to move towards the best parts of the world. So you have mass migration from the global south to the global, far more developed north. Why? Because there's an aspirational problem there. There's a better life to be achieved, better economy, better services, far more wealth. No thank you, right? So you want to flood there. Problems that happen. The difference between the status quo and now you have this world is that there are no restrictions to that barrier. Things that would have kept people in the global south no longer exist, right? So because it's open borders and the free ability to move. No, thank you. Couple of problems. First, from the countries you're leaving, there's mass brain drain of all the intelligent people moving out. But more crucially, in the status quo, you have cheap labor in countries in the developing world. But now that you've made it easier for these people to move across, and presumably you want them to move across for your government to stand as well, you also no longer have the cheap labor for manufacturing industries to be able to go there either, right? So not only do you have the smartest people moving off, but you also have the poorest. You essentially lose your entire working age population, which cripples local economies in the global south. But it's also a problem for the countries you go to. You flood them with mass amounts of workers, which means you do not have enough jobs left anymore. Services are crippled because you can't cope with the massive number of people coming in. You don't have enough housing, so people start becoming homeless. Ghettos and slums start creating, and that's what leads to more tension and violence, which we'll get onto in a second. But here's a second problem. They prop a government, and it's a quick clip in response to Alasdair. They prop a global political and economic union with one economic policy across the board. Here's why that's problematic. 3 reasons.
One, you need to have your individual currency in order to properly best control your own economy. In order for people to be able to move around, like it happens with the EU, you need a common currency, right? Why is that a problem? If you're struggling, you need to be able to devalue your currency or restructure. You can't do that on their side because, some places it'll be good to have a strong currency, right? You have to have the goods expensive. But that means in the poorer areas, basic goods become unaffordable because of the strength of the currency and your inability to earn that quick. But it also means you can't restructure and hyperinflation occurs. Second problem, you can't set particular interest rates that are good for your local economy that allow people to figure out what best level you need in order to encourage investments and loans taken out. You also you have to set one global level of income tax that may be okay for, let's say, the rich people in the global north, but it takes away a disproportionate amount of money from people from worse off households. That's why you get a tanking economy. I'll take opening now.
You've heard of progressive taxation, yeah?
What? Progressive taxation hasn't solved the crisis that occurs in the EU. Progressive taxation has nothing to do with interest rates, central bank policy. That's just a flippant response, and that's not how the world works. Second, conflict. You get fiat over this happening peacefully. You need to be a bit more specific about why it will continue to work in a functional way. That is not something you get fiat over, no matter how good you are stylistically. Second problem, conflict is increasing. Previously, you said, look, oh no, it's fine. We've still got if you're in the US or in the UK, it's fine. Standards may fall, but you've still got your own country as far better off than people in the world outside. But now, when you've got people flooding in, your standards decrease. Your life, your son's life is going to be a lot worse than yours. Your life will be a lot worse than your parents' life, right? That is what pisses people off when what you otherwise are going to have now decreases considerably because you have to share it with a lot more people. Not only does the pot decrease, but you get less of the pot than you were originally going to get. No, you just realize that people are going to start hating their neighbors a lot more than they already do. It's unclear to a Saudi Arabian citizen why their tax dollar needs to go to Israel, right? No offense, guys, right? But that's just how it works. I'm sure you know the same way about your tax dollar going to countries like Iran. It's unclear why that will not piss people off to the point that they say, look, government is premised on this hypothetical world where man is good. Man is shit. That is not the world government lives in, and I don't actually know why. But no, your religion, your language, your culture, how you look, how you dress, what you eat, all different. Yes, Singapore is a great multicultural pot. India is not, right? Other things are. India is not just a case of example trading in this particular instance, right? It's a case of why, when your standards decrease, and there's a clear group that you can point to, you get angry. Why is that problematic? Not only are we going to go into bold claim that you get outright conflict in this instance, right? Where large groups of societies either prevent people from coming in. I'm not actually sure how armies work in their world, but presumably you have federal states of some form which have their own militaries, right? Which means when people get pissed off and they have local constituencies to cater, they're going to control their army to stop people from coming in. Or the rich states or rich communities opt out. Note, government's premise is that rich countries have to be part of this to be able to tax them and redistribute it. But if rich countries decide to opt out because they are not getting their fair share of what they worked hard for, then it's unclear why they won't get that conflict to begin with. The last thing I'm going to say here, on the you get a global you get a global government, right? I'm going to posit, let's say, it's a country like America. You get a democratic government who wants to pass lots of welfare laws. But you get a Republican government who wants to do the exact converse. It's not clear, beyond India-China majority, why the ideology that underpins their case is the one that comes into power to begin with, right? We say it's random, but if it falls on our side, the consequences are far worse than they are in the status quo. Proud to oppose.
And now let's back Hazell to close the case for the government.
His water. His water.
Did you just bring a bottle of wine?
Yeah, his water is a bit different. It's Patrick. Okay. Because not even allowed in India. Really? Look at this one.
It's kind of the same.
Good island. There already is a global dictator that coerces us in every aspect of our lives. And that global dictator is biological necessity. That is the basis for any discussion of rights, the basis for any discussion of your ability to aggregate utility, and that is what Al gave us, which for some reason Assad gave no response to, whether he wanted to lose for both him, but unsportingly for us as well. Thanks, Assad. So, 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on the nature of the state, this is open lock. Secondly, the kind of boring economic shit that Assad did. And thirdly, the environment. And for that, 2 extraneous points of rebuttal, primarily directed at the Irish. Number one, I think Mark Finn is great crap. Number 2, your self-pity honestly brings me to despair. But when one of your own achieves something, like, we can play this game all day. But as I was saying, when one of your own achieves something and reaches an Oxford final, you disown him. I despair. So, next, 2 things. First thing, opening opposition and their stuff about the nature of democracy. I mean, my priorities here are 1, make jokes, 2, win the debate, in that order. So, firstly, opening opposition. They tell us that democracy is reliant on a shared identity which we will necessarily lack in this world because Israel and Iraq or Iran or whatever don't really get on. Firstly, no analysis as to where the ability for people to share a cultural identity starts or stops. It seems pretty clear to me that, for example, in the United Kingdom, the cultural identity of the Scottish is different to the Welsh and to the English and indeed to the Northern Irish. I also posit they've given us no reason to believe or no analysis as to where this particularly stops or to why it is that the fact that the Iranians and the Israelis will cease getting on, because they do have many things in common, notably that they are humans and they would all like to not suffocate on this planet. Secondly, we also point out that it is the case that this idea of opposition or of distinct identity is contingent on things like nations existing, is contingent on the idea that you are everything that benefits you comes at the cost of comes at the cost of harming someone else, or sort of the other way around, but whatever. I've had a reasonable amount of wine. The point is that the only reason why Israel and Iran don't get on is because their interests do not align. We fix that. There is no reason to fetishize the idea that Ireland, and Britain have different interests when we say, look, now we're all part of one global community. Maybe Britain can just give Ireland a shitload of money. That will be fine now. Next thing, they say we can't fiat out that there will be no violence and we'll end up in this weird dictatorship. First thing, I think the prop fiat was that we will reach at least some semblance of a peaceful transition from the current status quo to global unity. This will probably require things like disarming armies that currently fight each other. So I think at the very least we can fiat out at least some level of disarmament and some level of reduction in the ability for countries to harm each other. But also, I don't see why global parliament necessitates the non-existence of a global Supreme Court, or even, a global House of Lords that will have at least some ability to prevent the worst excesses of democratic power that they say will happen. Next, CO. First observation, fun sponge. Second observation, I haven't heard the phrase brain drain since schools,
And trust me, that was a long time ago for me. To the extent that their arguments have weight in this debate, they say everyone in the global south is going to migrate north. No reason why the ideal of opening up, that we would eventually abolish borders, has to happen on day zero. But secondly, presumably at the point at which we do things like have global labour laws that are equivalent, global wealth redistribution so the global south gets a hell of a lot more money, it's very unclear. And lastly, the currency stuff. I honestly thought the POI was a joke, but to the extent that it's not, I would say that things like Bitcoin, fine, we'll set it at a level that aggregates global utility as opposed to the utility of the particular place that you say is useful. Next, the environment. Why we have won this debate? Because what Al lacks in charisma, by God, he makes up for in analytic work. As pointed out, and this responds to both opposition teams, but also kind of to opening gov and all their wishy-washy, like, the most important thing is like your ability, we only ascribe values to things that we will have value. But like, the brain and consciousness is not an ephemeral concept. It requires things like your neurons to have enough glucose and oxygen to function. Therefore, all of their benefits are contingent on you being alive, you having food, you having water, you having oxygen, and therefore, the fact that we are spiraling without any ability to stop towards global decay, people drowning, people lacking the ability to make enough food and have enough clean water to drink, means any political rights, any economic rights fail in comparison to the extension we give. And I'll give us a number of reasons why we think it is the case that we lack incentives under the status quo, or lack the ability under the status quo to fix these problems. And I'll go into those, but before I do, Ayal, why not?
The question in this debate is not what wonderful policies are possible, but which ones are likely. And we still analyze economic problems. We analyze worse politics, which includes worse economic politics.
I'm going to be honest. I thought we lost our semi, and half that judging panel is here, so fuck knows how this is going to go. But I agree that you've beaten your closing well done. I mean, the second thing I would say on this is, again, you have not given us sufficient reason to believe that we would just be pointlessly bad in the way we apply these policies. In fact, the opposite is true. The very thing you can do. So let's say we have our global government. Fine, let's play the boring mechanistic game. Right, so you have a bunch of federated states. You say, look, you decide your economic policy. Like, Westminster says, go on, Scotland, decide some things. It will be fun. The result of that is that, yes, maybe some of these economic policies will be decided at a federal level, but crucially what the global government has a particular incentive to do is decide policies on things that, as Al pointed out, are diffuse, don't necessarily affect a particular country or a particular region, but affect everyone. That is things like multilateral nuclear disarmament, but that's also things like putting in place carbon taxes, putting in place requirements that you don't pointlessly destroy the environment. And because the status quo is that we are competing against each other, we have incentives to pollute because it is beneficial for our country at the expense of another. We never fix those things. I mean, Joe Mays, the Irish, wasted at least 20 seconds of my time. So give me this. Look, at the end of the day, Alasdair Donovan is a proud Irish man. You should all be ashamed of yourselves. Closing done.
Serious debate. Wow. In terms of who he is as well. Like, you know his CV? Like, do you know his name? No, I don't know. Exactly. At least they had some beef with each other, with someone. This guy is not in that hierarchy. Just remember. He's this man. He's in it to win it. Yeah, well, his team just lost.
No.
I can't pretend that in political opposition we're the good guys in this debate. We have been incredibly boring, we've talked about the economy, and we've told you that people aren't going to have money, and that's unfortunate because, you know, everyone likes money, especially this government, which refuses to talk about it. But the fundamental problem is two things. The first thing is, when you tell people that what we're going to do is we're going to tax you, and not just to provide the hundreds of millions of people in the USA, or the hundreds of millions of people in India, or the hundreds of millions of people in China, but literally billions of people, right? You fundamentally break economies across the world, because unfortunately, no individual country can save its own people from poverty that is not generating enough money. It certainly can't do that for the world as a whole. The second problem is, when you have, whether it be India and China, whether it be the US, whether it be somebody else, dictating to the rest of the world what policies are going to be, especially when you can't even afford those policies because of your laughable attempt at propping this motion. Right? So first of all, yes, opening government gives you this beautiful idea of redistribution. But because of the Lahav curve, Sam, right? But Sam pointed out, we get rid of the Lahav curve. No, you don't, right? Because the Lahav curve necessarily is, right, the point of how much tax am I willing to take before I stop working? Already in places like Scandinavia, the tax is about 60%, right? Already in the US, it's about 35. Already in the UK, it's 45. And it's already reached a point where we can't, even with that level of taxation, we can't provide for the people in our own nation. In order to be able to provide for everyone, taxes necessarily have to increase. Why the fuck are we going to work, right, when your taxes are being taxed like 85-90%? To help people who aren't even in your state, who aren't for the reasons that I've already told you, we don't care about the status quo. People who disagree, who actually think that you shouldn't exist as a state, in the case of people who don't like Israel. People who massively draw people for generations, and then you have to sit in their chamber and listen to them like make fun of your friends. The problem is, however, when you see across the world, you might be able to, you might expect in a couple of months, but more and more people to go, why on earth am I going to work? I'm just going to be one of these poor people who's going to get paid for with 85, 90, 95% of my money being taxed. The whole tax pool disintegrates, right? There is no money for anyone anymore. That means your situation in the status quo, which we completely agree is abhorrent, where we have a situation where there are so many people who are poverty, that's increased, because now we can be currently in poverty, going with less money to provide for them. That's why you don't get your benefits. And your argument about solving green technology is structurally the same as that, right? And necessarily, in order to save climate, that's an issue that's going to face us 50, 60, 70, 80 years from now, and we need lots of money to do, right? And the reason we're not doing it at the moment is we don't currently have enough money to provide basic necessities for our own people. When you destroy the global economy in the way that we just described, you're not going to then go, oh yeah, you know what, this like very small amount of information. Why don't we save something that's going to exist in 90 years when we're all dead because we killed each other? So you're not going to get that either, right? In addition to this, why are you going to tank the economy? We've explained why you fundamentally, as soon as this policy is put into place, you get what Sam correctly said. We allow people to go to countries they want to go. But that's only going to move one way. Because in the status quo, the best jobs, the best infrastructure, the best services, like health, education, and being able to finer things in life, are fundamentally in certain areas of the world. And as Sam says, you've taken away the restrictions of those people going there. Therefore, even if you don't get everyone flocking there, which is like Matt's pitiful attempt at responding, like taking the argument that's absolutely works, right? Even if lots of people move, right, from the reasons we've stated, it disrupts that state from who they move, because they can't now provide the basic jobs and stuff that they need, and
And then you have the additional pressures in the Western countries, which Asad already talked about, which went unresponded to. What also went unresponded to throughout the bench, yes, I genuinely did not want to be in Oxford final and have to ask about currency, right? I do apologise for that. But, for example, if you look at the EU, it's got lots of things, right? You've got like various states put together. Ireland got fucked over, Greece got fucked over. But anyway, lots of countries got screwed over because essentially the bigger countries, in this case Germany, that the currency was tailored to their country, right? It was tailored to their economy. Imagine that situation over 258, right? The response, I love this, by the way, right? We're just aggravating, right? Like, what's that? Like, come on. How on earth is that a response? Even if you aggravate it, there are countries on both ends of the extreme which are completely illogical. They can't devalue their currency. There's massive inflation in certain places because the currencies worth far more. The currency, they can't afford, essentially, they can't afford to buy different services because they cannot produce enough region. And therefore they can't provide those services as well. No, they can't, right? So then now I want to talk about how this affects like people's actual identity and ability to self-determine. I think opening opposition do a very good job of explaining politics, right? But fundamentally, again, this does hinge on economics because it doesn't matter, right, what you want and whether you can vote for it, even if you're not getting outvoted by Indo and China. If you can't afford to do shit, it doesn't matter if it's like, oh, I would really love to live in a world which had, like, everyone gets given like their own car, or I want to have a world where I kind of respect, people of different ethnicities or people of different sexualities, right? If you're in a situation where the global economy is not in a position to be able to buy anything really for that many people at all, you get conflict. You get people saying, you get countries where, again, no response, right? Saying, we're going to take back our own, we're going to at least protect ourselves, or we're going to go back and take other things. Those things, unfortunately, as well explained as it was. By the way, we don't win it clearly, right? Secondly, in this debate, you can't have self-determination if you can't afford to put food on the table where you can't afford to buy the basic things to make life living. It has been in many ways a pleasure to speak in front of you, and thanks very much.